Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's recording of the FiscalNote CQ Roll Call Budget Podcast. My name is Evan Campbell, and I'll be helping out today with my colleague Chris with some of the technical aspects of the podcast. We'd like to thank you for joining us today and supporting both FiscalNote and CQ Roll Call. We'll be hosting the same podcast weekly on Tuesdays at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time to give you an opportunity to speak directly with the experts on Capitol Hill. I've got just a few quick housekeeping items to get covered before we get started. You'll see a Q&A box and a chat box on your screen. If you would like to submit a question to our panelists, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. If at any point you run into any technical issues, please use the chat box and Chris will try and resolve the issue. Please submit your questions to the Q&A box at any time throughout the podcast, and we'll try to get to as many as possible during our time together. Everyone is in muted mode upon entry, so please use the chat and Q&A box to communicate with our hosts or Chris. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our hosts, Jennifer Schutt and David Lerman.
I'm David Lerman, your budget tracker.
And I'm Jennifer Schutt, Budget and Appropriations reporter.
And today we wanted to focus on the labor HHS education spending bill because it's the biggest non-defense bill of the year. It encompasses so many programs that are so vital for so many people. We're talking about everything from Alzheimer's and cancer research to the Title X family planning grants to Occupational Safety and Health Administration, jobs programs, Head Start, childcare, Pell Grants, so much more. And it just got out of the House committee yesterday on a party line vote, so there's big fights ahead. But before we get to that bill specifically, Jen, we did get some news yesterday about the process on the House floor and all the action coming up there to get some of these spending bills moving. Bring us up to date a little bit on what we know now on the schedule.
Yeah, we have a little bit of a clearer picture of what the House floor is going to be debating when it comes in next week for that 2-week session that it has scheduled before it leaves town again for its August recess. One big thing is that 2-week House session could turn into a 3-week House session, depending on how talks on a COVID-19 supplemental spending bill go. But we did get a much clearer picture from House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, a Democrat of Maryland, about when those spending bills will be on the floor. And so next week, they're going to start off with a 4-bill spending package that includes the Agriculture, Interior Environment, Military Construction VA, and State Foreign Operations funding bills. That'll be on the House floor next Thursday and Friday. And then the following week, that last full week of July, we don't know exactly what funding package will be on the House floor. Hoyer didn't lay that out in his Dear Colleague letter that he sent out Monday afternoon, but he did say that he hopes by the end of July to have the House having passed legislation that funds about 96% of the government. And it's really likely that that other 4%, as we've reported, is going to be the Homeland Security spending bill. That's probably not going to the House floor for the second year in a row. There are concerns among progressive Democrats about funding levels in the bill for Customs and Border Protection and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And so it's unlikely that Democrats would have enough votes from within their party to advance that Homeland Security spending bill. So my best guess right now on what that second funding package will be is that I'm pretty sure it's going to be the Commerce, Justice, Science, Defense, Energy, Water, Financial Services, Labor, HHS Education, Legislative Branch, and Transportation HUD funding bills. And then that will kind of wrap up the House's role for right now in the annual appropriations process, because as I'm sure we're all aware, we're still getting crickets from the Senate on when they may release their funding bills, if they'll mark up their funding bills, or whether or not we even see floor debate over there, which I think, given the timeline, is highly unlikely.
Yeah, so after months of delay here, we're finally going to see spending bills get moving, though, at least in the House. And that's a big package next week of 4 spending bills wrapped together into one bundle, which is not uncommon, we should say. They often have to bundle these things together to get them done because they run out of time all the time. But at least they're moving now, and so if they get most of their bills done this month, it can at least set up negotiations with the Senate if the Senate ever gets moving on them, right? I guess maybe September for the Senate.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical at this point that the Senate Appropriations Committee marks up any of their bills. I personally would really like to see that happen. I really enjoy the type of debate that happens in the Senate Appropriations Committee, but I really don't think that's likely this year. I think even if they can negotiate a fifth COVID-19 aid package, and therefore appropriators on the committee would need to offer those amendments, which have been causing a bit of an issue. I still think there's a lot of other amendment debate. It's going to be really tricky to sort out on the Senate side during an election year. And so I think the best case scenario right now in the Senate is that they release their funding bills as is and then go directly to conference with the House. I'm still hoping for markups, but I just think given the timeline and that it's an election year, and kind of the way that everything's been going with negotiating a fifth COVID package, I just don't see it happening.
Okay, so that's what we know about the schedule. Now let's get to the labor HHS bill because it's a monster as usual. It's about $196 billion in regular discretionary funding. And that doesn't count all this emergency funding that comes on top of it for the COVID-19 pandemic that Democrats want to include, that's making some Republicans unhappy, right, Jim?
Right. So the Labor HHS and Education Funding Bill includes 24.4 billion in emergency funding. A lot of this would go to address the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institutes of Health, and the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, also known as BARDA, would all get significant chunks of that emergency funding. State and public health officials would also get some. And the idea is to really kind of address the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic as we continue to see spikes in cases and deaths throughout the country. Democrats on the House Appropriations Committee have been saying that they really think that in addition to negotiating these standalone packages, there needs to be money in the annual spending bills to address this long term, especially as we look towards early 2021 and to hopefully a vaccine coming out and all the types of issues with distribution that the country, the federal government and state governments are going to see with trying to get a vaccine out. Republicans, are extremely concerned about that emergency funding. And Ranking Member Tom Cole pointed out that for NIH specifically, their non-emergency funding would only increase by about $275 million. NIH is a hugely popular bipartisan institution. They, for the last few years, have enjoyed really significant increases in funding. And so Representative Cole was saying during the markup this week that he's concerned that once the House enters conference negotiations with the Senate, during which time it's highly likely that this emergency spending goes away or is significantly reduced, the NIH would not really see its inflation plus increases like it's been used to getting from Congress. So there are some significant concerns there from Republicans.
Yeah, NIH is always popular with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and they're used to substantial increases in that agency, not including emergencies. And we should say, I mean, this emergency money, it's really rubbing Republicans the wrong way, not just in this bill, but in all the bills, because Republicans say they had no buy-in to it. There was no input from Republicans in crafting it. And they wanted to treat the pandemic separately in a separate legislation. And there are talks that are going to be going on for a separate bill. And so Republicans just don't want to see it bundled up into these annual bills and inflating the cost of the annual bills. So that could really cause a problem here down the road, right?
Yeah, Republicans have been saying during subcommittee markups and full committee markups that Democrats putting billions upon billions of dollars throughout the annual funding bills in emergency spending violates that 2-year spending caps agreement that the House, the Senate, and the Trump administration reached last summer. They say any additional emergency funding, whether it be for COVID-19 or potential natural disasters, needs to be addressed in those standalone negotiated packages, and that it really shouldn't be kind of weaved into these annual funding bills in the appropriations process. So we know that's something that's going to be an issue throughout the next few months as the House and Senate and the White House get into some type of conference negotiations, although we're not really sure yet what those are going to look like.
Yeah, so this was a party line vote yesterday, 30-22, with all Republicans opposing it. Give us some of the highlights, Jen. What are some of the other big sticking points here in this bill?
Yeah, Republicans mentioned their concerns about charter school funding reductions. The House bill includes about 400 million for the charter school program. That would be a 40 million reduction below enacted levels. Congressman Tom Cole and a couple other Republicans on the committee were frustrated by that, and they don't think that this is an appropriate thing for Democrats to be doing, especially as there are ongoing conversations about the best way for students in K through 12 education, as well as universities and colleges, to get back to school. And so they are opposed to those cuts, and they expect that to be one of the more forthright issues during conference negotiations. There's also concerns about policy language that the Democrats put in the bill regarding Title X, Title 10 family planning grants. These are the grants that we all heard about last year when the Trump administration put in a new rule because Planned Parenthood would no longer be eligible to apply for these family planning grants through Health and Human Services. And so Democrats are essentially reversing that Trump administration decision so that Planned Parenthood could, if it chooses to, once again apply for these family planning grants. Republicans say that that's really a step too far and that they cannot support that. There's also a lot of language in here addressing unaccompanied children. We have not heard a lot lately about the issue of unaccompanied children migrating up through Mexico from South and Central America. But when unaccompanied children arrive at the border, they are not taken care of by Homeland Security. They're taken care of by Health and Human Services. And so Democrats put language in this bill that would bar HHS from sharing information that children discuss during mental health or therapy sessions with Homeland Security or Justice for immigration enforcement purposes. So that's one issue that we've heard about from Democrats for months and that they just hope to sort of codify in that bill. But that's another issue that Republicans are really going to be focused on later this year when the House and Senate are working out these bills.
Yeah, and then there's one issue that could really be an interesting fight here on the House floor whenever they get to it, not next week, but maybe the week after, which is a growing concern among some in the Democratic Party about the so-called Hyde Amendment. This is the annual rider in the bill that blocks federal funding for paying for abortions in most cases. And there is a growing sense among the progressive wing of the party that they just don't want to see that anymore. They think it's discriminatory for poor women not to be able to get abortions. The Hyde Amendment had long been seen as sort of a truce in the abortion wars. As long as the federal government wasn't paying for it, then they were allowing abortions generally, but that was the deal, was that no federal funding. And now you're seeing a lot of pushback from Democrats. And this bill still has that rider in it. And that's going to cause a problem because some of the progressives have already made clear that they intend to fight that on the floor and seek an amendment to strip off the Hyde Amendment. And the subcommittee chairwoman, Rosa DeLauro, who heads Labor HHS, put Hyde in her bill, but she said she is going to fight to remove it. Now, she didn't do it yesterday in committee, so I assume that means she's going to do it when the bill comes to the floor, and there'll be some kind of amendment on the floor to remove the Hyde Amendment, and that is going to trigger a big fight over abortion policy, and that could cause a problem for this bill.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really challenging for the House Rules Committee and for House Democratic leadership to kind of tiptoe the very complicated line this year between progressive Democrats who really want to see this removed and view it as an issue of racial justice, and more moderate Democrats who are going to be facing tough re-election in the fall and whose districts might not support Hyde being removed from the annual funding bills. I do not anticipate that the House Rules Committee is going to approve either of these funding packages with an open rule that would allow for any member to offer any amendment they want to the funding bills. I very much expect a structured rule process where any member can offer an amendment to the Rules Committee, but then the Rules Committee sort of filters through those amendments and puts a limited number of them on the floor for debate. That is a tool that Republicans and Democrats use on large bills, particularly funding bills, in an election year to avoid controversial issues. That being said, an amendment stripping Hyde from the Labor HHS education funding bill would absolutely be germane. So this is going to be a really tough thing if Democratic leadership wants to block that from getting to the floor to protect their moderates from having to take a roll call vote on it. That could be a really challenging thing to justify.
Okay, I don't want to go too long, and I did want to leave a little time for questions. If you have a question, there's a little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, you should be able to type in a question if you have any. And Jen and I will try to field them as best as we can. And let me see, while we wait for any questions to come in, should say also, I guess, just to bring people up to date, the energy water bill also cleared the committee yesterday. That was much less controversial. And they did, I think, 5 bills last week in committee. So they have made some decent progress here. And then there's, today as we speak, there's 3 more bills the committee is going to take up: Defense, the Commerce, Justice, Science, and the Transportation HUD bills. And then they're saving for Wednesday, we're going to have the Homeland Security bill, which is going to trigger a whole fight over the border wall again. That'll be a big one. And that's why that bill probably won't get to the House floor at all. They're going to just sidestep that and wait for final negotiations in conference. And also the financial services bill they have to do on Wednesday, which funds the Treasury, IRS, White House. So that will give them, if they do all those, it's going to be a busy next few days, and then the committee will have finished its work for the year and awaiting action in the Senate. And I think we have one question now. It says, any sense regarding how many packages of appropriations bills there will be and what will go together? Next week, 4 will go together, but after that, any sense of the combination? Yeah, they haven't announced. We know next week there are those 4 that we talked about.
That's the Agriculture, Interior Environment, Military Construction VA, and State Foreign Ops spending bills. And then we don't yet know what the other package of funding bills is going to be exactly, but it's really unlikely that Homeland Security spending bill goes to the floor. And based on Leader Hoyer's Dear Colleague letter yesterday, it sounds like there's just going to be 2 packages on the House floor. So I expect that second package to include the Commerce, Justice, Science, Defense, Energy, Water, Financial Services, Labor, HHS, Education, Legislative Branch, and Transportation HUD bills.
Yeah, it would go into maybe 1 or 2 bundles, probably, right? I mean, we just don't know. We just don't know. But I mean, they could probably do them in 1 or 2 packages, I would think. They can't do, they just don't have time to do them individually. And at this point, they really do need to bundle a good number of them together to get them through, because they're trying to get all these done before the August recess, with the exception of Homeland Security, which just isn't going to happen, I don't think.
Another question, do you expect final votes on the minibuses will be bipartisan or strictly party line? I personally expect them to be very close to party line. We could see 1 or 2 Republicans vote with Democrats, potentially very moderate Republicans, some of whom might be retiring at the end of this Congress. But other than that, this batch of bills will not be broadly bipartisan.
And another question here, Venn diagram of the 5th pandemic relief bill. Where do the House, Senate, and administration intersect? What's the best guess on top line dollars for state and local governments? What's the best guess on supplemental pandemic UI, unemployment insurance? Yeah, I mean, this is still very preliminary, and they have not begun talks really in earnest yet on this next pandemic relief bill. But we have had some interesting comments being thrown back and forth among the leaders on television recently in public appearances. And clearly one hangup that I wrote about yesterday is this unemployment benefits thing. What to do about these expanded unemployment benefits that from the federal government of an extra $600 a week are going to run out at the end of this month. And so there's a lot of pressure on them to extend that in some form. And I think my sense now is both parties agree that some kind of unemployment aid has to be extended, because we're still talking about mass unemployment here of almost 18 million people in the country. But there's still a divide on how do you extend it. And Republicans were very unhappy with this flat $600 a week thing, because they say it was a disincentive to go back to work, because a lot of people were making more in benefits than they made on the job. And so that was causing a real problem with Republicans. And Democrats said they had to do it that way because the Labor Department just couldn't calculate. The initial intent of Democrats is just to make workers whole, to give them whatever they were making on the job, but that the Labor Department just didn't have the technology or ability to calculate benefits based on each worker's individual salary. So they came up with this flat figure. Now, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin said he's working on a technical fix, whatever that means, to restructure how these benefits would be paid. That'll be very interesting to watch, because if they can solve this rift over unemployment, I think they go a long way toward crafting a new bill. But then there's also this big issue of state and local government aid. The states and local governments are just bleeding revenue from the economic shutdown, and there's a huge demand from them for federal assistance. And Democrats are pushing for as much as $1 trillion just for state and local governments at this point. And Republicans have been very resistant to that idea on the grounds that they don't want to be bailing out states that may have been poorly managed before the pandemic even hit. And so they really don't like that idea. They're willing to do some. They're not ruling out some aid, but clearly they want a lot less than Democrats want. And so that's going to be another big sticking point in these talks. So I don't know. It's still going to be a big battle, and whether they can get it all done by the end of the month is going to be tough. Mitch McConnell did say that he plans to present a Republican proposal when the Senate comes back in session next week. And so that'll be sort of a starting point of where these talks may be headed. But there's a lot of work left to do on that.
Yeah, and both parties do seem to be still pretty far apart in total spending for this fifth COVID-19 relief bill. Democrats' proposal that they debated in the House, that was about $3 trillion in additional emergency spending. From what we're hearing right now, it sounds like Senate Republicans' proposal is going to be around $1.3 trillion in spending. So there's a lot of movement between those two numbers in terms of how the parties come closer together on total spending for this next aid bill. We've heard a lot of concerns from some Republicans about the debt and the deficit and the volume of increased emergency spending that we've seen this year. So that's going to be another thing that they have to work out in a very short amount of time, as each party leader really keeps their eye on the November elections and their most vulnerable members.
Another one here, looking a little further ahead, any sense of the schedule for September other than a CR? I think that's sort of what we were getting at before, was that there's a chance the Senate appropriators could try to mark up their spending bills in September, but it was looking doubtful, and we really don't know, and there's going to be less incentive for them to do that now as we approach election season, and they know they're going to need a CR anyway. So I don't know if we're going to see those markups happen or not. That Senate process got derailed when Democrats wanted, as they did in the House, Democrats in the Senate wanted to put pandemic relief money into these annual bills, and the Senate Appropriations Chairman Richard Shelby, Republican of Alabama, did not like that at all and postponed his markup. So I don't know. September's going to be iffy for that. There certainly will have to be a continuing resolution, that stopgap measure to extend funding for when the fiscal year begins October 1st. And I think that'll be the focus of September, really, because that's the must-pass legislation, short of more pandemic relief. Anything to add to that, Jen?
No, you pretty much covered it. I think the
Yeah.
CR goes till sometime during the lame duck, and then really what happens during the lame duck is completely contingent on the election results. So there's really no way to predict those at this point in time.
And this question says, love listening to you both every week. And that's not actually a question, but we like hearing that, so thank you. And I think we can end it there then.
Yeah,
Evan,
I'll jump in, David.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like with that we're out of time. So I just want to thank Jennifer and David for leading the conversation. Our next budget podcast will be at the same time next Tuesday on July 21st at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So be on the lookout for a link to log in for next week's recording, as well as a reminder email from us. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.